Appendix 4 in the book deals with Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27, the so-called 70 weeks. One scholar says this, that Daniel 9, 24 through 27, presents the most difficult text in the book, as commentators agree, but they most certainly do not agree as to the right way to understand the figures given. All one can do is to continue to apply agreed criteria as consistently as possible, weigh carefully the conclusions of others, and make suggestions as to the most likely solution to a difficult problem. Now, one reason I'm discussing this is that it deals with eschatology, and it is perhaps the single most important text upon which dispensationalism bases its entire eschatology. But you need to understand, I think doing so is fraught with difficulty, because I'll begin this by saying there are multiple interpretive questions on this whole passage. This is one of the most, as I say, difficult passages in the entire Old Testament, if not in the entire Bible. Verse 24 says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy, or as my Bible translates, the most holy place. There are many interpretive issues right in this verse, such as, it says 70 weeks. Well, it doesn't, that's an interpretation. It's 70 what? Weeks, sevens, periods of time. And again, in your book, I go through all of these things in detail. I do not have the time, and I will not discuss all the specific issues, but I'm just raising the questions here. Is this a chronology or chronography? What's the difference? Well, a chronology is a sequential order of events in history. A chronography is a stylized scheme of history used to interpret historical data. Now, this may be a chronology, it may be a chronography, or it may be a combination of both. What to finish, make an end of, make atonement for, bring in everlasting righteousness, and seal up mean in this context? Who or what is the most holy? Is it a place, a person, or people that is supposed to be anointed? Verse 25 says, so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again, with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Well, which decree is involved here? There are several possibilities that have been used by scholars. Jeremiah's prophecy itself about the 70 years in Jeremiah 25:12, or in Jeremiah 29, verse 10. Jeremiah's prophecies of restoration in Jeremiah 30 and 31. Gabriel's own words to Daniel. Cyrus's decree recorded in Ezekiel 1. Darius's decree recorded in Ezekiel 6. Artaxerxes' decree recorded in Ezra 7. And Artaxerxes' warrant given to Nehemiah in Nehemiah 2. So 7 different decrees. Which is the right one? Who is the anointed one? The prince. Now, the New American Standard and the New King James translate the Hebrew as until Messiah the Prince. The NIV reads until the anointed one, the ruler. The ESV and the RSV read to the coming of an anointed one, a prince. So, the Hebrew word Mashiach has no definite article, and therefore should be rendered an anointed one instead of the Messiah. So again, it's not clear. Is it talking about the Messiah or somebody else? Verse 26. Then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. Questions. Is the anointed one of verse 26 the same as the anointed one of verse 25? What does cut off and have nothing mean? Who are the people of the prince who is to come? What do the end and flood refer to? And verse 27. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Well, who is he? Is it the prince to come, or just who? What is the covenant that's being referred to? What does put a stop to sacrifices refer to? What is the wing of abominations? And is it desolate or desolator? Most translations say that destruction will be poured out on the one who makes desolate. In other words, the one who's causing desolation. But some translations say that destruction is poured out on the desolate. And so it's not clear. Now, I point these out because and I've been reading from the New American Standards translation, but you note that with all of these questions, and in the book, I go through the different possibilities for each one. We haven't got time to go through that, read the book. But the point is, every time you make a decision on any one of these multiple issues that arise from the Hebrew grammar, you're making an interpretation that is going to affect your interpretation of the entire passage, which is why I think that since dispensationalism relies almost, if not exclusively, on this passage for its view of eschatology, they get one of these things wrong, then their entire eschatology is wrong. Now, as we've talked in other lectures, I think their entire eschatology is wrong for multiple reasons, but to base it on such a difficult passage with so many issues, and then to get each one right, I think that's not a very wise procedure. Now, there are different interpretive approaches to this passage. Contemporary interpretations fall into three main groups. Those who see the passage primarily concerning historical Jerusalem, culminating in Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean Revolt, which ended in 164 BC. These are known as the Antiochene views. Secondly, those who see this as a Messianic passage, primarily relating to the first coming of Christ. These are known as Messianic views. And thirdly, those who see this as culminating with a future Antichrist and a future Israel and Jerusalem, those are the dispensational views. Now, each of these has sort of subsets within it. I will just give you, but in the book, I discuss the reasoning and critique each of these views. Won't do that here, but I'll just give you the basic positions of the three main views, and you can flesh it out in the book yourself. The classic Antiochene interpretation is that the 490 years begins with Jeremiah's prophecy in Jeremiah 25 in 605 BC, or his prophecies of restoration in Jeremiah 30 and 31 in 587 BC. And these include the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem, and end with the rededication of the temple and the death of Antiochus Epiphanes in 164 BC. This interpretation views at least the first two sets of sevens as figurative and schematic, since from 605 to 164 is only 440 years, not 490 years. The anointed one of verse 25 is seen as the high priest Joshua and or governor Zerubbabel. The cutting off of the anointed one in verse 26 is taken as referring to the murder of the high priest Onias III in 171 BC. The covenant in verse 27 is taken as Antiochus Epiphanes' agreement with the Hellenizing Jews, and the stopping of sacrifices is Antiochus's stopping of Jewish sacrifices in 167 BC. Now, the Messianic views, again, there's a couple of variants of this, but the classic Messianic view, the promises of verse 24 are all seen as messianic, in other words, relating to what Jesus did. Artaxerxes' decree, recorded in Ezra 7, which stems from 458 or 457 BC, is taken as the starting point for a literal chronology. The first set of sevens covers the actual rebuilding of Jerusalem, verse 25a. The 62 weeks immediately following terminates with Jesus' baptism in AD 26 or 27. Jesus is the anointed one of verse 25, and the prince who is to come in verse 26 is often seen as Titus, since Jesus cited verses 26 and 27 in the Olivet Discourse. Others see the prince as Christ and his people as the Jews who rejected him and thereby brought about the destruction of the city by the Romans. In other words, Daniel's prophecy is saying essentially what Christ said in the Olivet Discourse. Most view the covenant of verse 27 as Jesus is finalizing the Abrahamic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant finds its fulfillment in the new covenant, so that is basically what's being looked at. The stopping of sacrifices is generally seen as Jesus' death on the cross, which legally terminated the efficacy of the Jewish sacrificial system. Now, there's no specific termination of the 70th week. Some view the 70th week as ending with the death of Stephen or the conversion of Paul or Cornelius and taking the gospel to the Gentiles, or as symbolic of the entire time until Christ returns. But the destruction of Jerusalem was not listed in verse 24 as one of the 6 goals of the prophecy. And so, therefore, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 must be regarded not as necessarily falling within the 77s, but as a consequence of the action of the Messiah in causing the sacrifices to cease. And so the dispensational views are rather different. According to this view, the prophecy anticipates the establishment of Israel's millennial kingdom under the authority of the promised king. This interpretation views the 70 weeks as 490 literal years. The starting point they normally choose is Artaxerxes' warrant given to Nehemiah in 445 or 444 BC. However, the 490 years from that point would terminate in AD 46 or 47, which are dates of no significance at all. To the end of the 69th week, 483 years, would be in about AD 39 or 40. Again, dates of no particular significance. And therefore, to try to get the 69 weeks to end on some date having to do with Christ, dispensationalists do not use regular years, but they use what they call prophetic years of 360 days. And then they turn those years into days by adding extra days to account for leap years, thereby giving a total of 173,880 days, which amounts to only 476 real years instead of 483 real years, which would be the 69 weeks. Well, that puts the end of the recalculated 69th week sometime in AD 32 or 33, which they believe was the time of Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But So the anointed one in verse 25 is Jesus. The cutting off is his death on the cross, even though his death was after the 62 weeks. But the dispensationalists, since his death was after the 62 weeks, they don't believe that his death was in the 70th week, but before the 70th week. And so they claim that the 70th week does not immediately follow the 69th week, but there's a great parenthesis in time between the two, which now has lasted for over 2,000 years. They hold that the 70th week relates solely to events that occur just before Jesus comes again. And this 70th week is the period of 7 years which lie basically between the pre-tribulational rapture and the return of Christ in glory. And so the people of the prince who is to come, in verse 26, the people is the Roman people, but the prince is not Christ or Titus, but the Antichrist, who is the king of a restored Roman confederacy. And so the covenant is an agreement, they believe, the Antichrist makes with Israel to guarantee Israel's safety in the land. And the stopping of sacrifices is Antichrist disallowing the sacrifices halfway through the 70th week. He then persecutes the Jews and is destroyed by the second coming of Christ. So, in my view, that is just absolutely bizarre. We talk about and critique this and all of the views in the book. I would simply point out this. Daniel 9:24 through 27 is a unity. It says there's one period of 70 weeks. And the plural of 70 weeks is followed by the singular verb. It says the 70 weeks is decreed. It's a singular verb, which indicates the unity of the 70 weeks. And there's no basis in the language for having 69 weeks and then a gap so far of 2,000 years before the 70th week. So, and in fact, the various promises in verse 24, verses 25 through 27, they actually pick up and repeat and elaborate the summary of the entire 70-week period, rather than talking about some 70th week divorced from the rest of the time period. So again, I'm not going to be able to go, and I'm not going to be able to critique all of these three main views. But what I will make some more comments on this important passage of Scripture. First, we talked about the issue, is the 70 weeks a chronology or a chronography? Now, the exile itself into Babylon was not exactly 70 years. No way that you can, depending upon the starting point you use to the restoration, none of it comes to exactly 70 years. And now, it's also interesting that if Daniel's numbers really had been intended, as some interpreters suppose, to give a precise prediction of the date of Jesus' life and death, it's remarkable that neither Jesus nor any of the New Testament writers appeal to Daniel 9 to support their messianic claims. Now, as we will see, that I believe this does relate, and my position basically is the messianic position. But we need to understand, behind the prophecy is God's covenant relationship with Israel, which included a pattern of Sabbaths, Sabbath years, and the Sabbath Jubilee. Now, Daniel's prayer, beginning in the beginning of Daniel 9, refers to God who keeps his covenant, even though Israel had violated that covenant and has not listened to the prophets. As a result, the curses that God had prescribed for covenant disobedience had fallen on Israel. Now that's the background for Daniel 9:24 through 27. And this passage is God's unique answer to Israel's problem. Daniel 9 is the only chapter in Daniel to use God's covenant name, namely Yahweh. And this prayer regarding covenant loyalty is answered in terms of the covenant Sabbath pattern of 70 weeks. And so now it's interesting. The goal of the 70 weeks, as set forth in Daniel 9, verse 24, is an ultimate age of fulfillment and completion. That's why Daniel 9:24 says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And so its accomplishment, basically is the accomplishment of all the prophecies of God's new and everlasting covenant and the eschatological jubilee. I mean, this is basically showing this is what the whole Old Testament leading up to Messiah is all about. Basically, it is showing the completion of the biblical story. Now, in that regard, according to Daniel 9, verse 2, Daniel was praying, and he says, I observed in the books of the number of years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. In other words, the exile. And now Daniel was concerned about the end of the exile. Yet, even before Israel entered the land under Joshua, God had a plan for his people to return from exile into which he would send them. That's indicated in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 10. Now, you see, according to God's plan, particularly in Isaiah 42 through 43, God's plan for Israel's return from exile involved two stages. The first is the physical return from exile, Isaiah 42 through 43. But the second stage is the spiritual return. It deals with the problem of sin and about forgiveness and reconciliation in a renewed covenant between Yahweh and his people. We see that in Isaiah 32 through 44. Now, according to the structure of Isaiah's message, Cyrus, King Cyrus, is the agent for the return from Babylon, and the servant of the Lord is the agent for the return from sin. Daniel's prayer is focused on the physical return from Babylon, the first stage of redemption. But the angelic message and the vision of the 70 weeks is focused on the forgiveness of sins and the renewal of the covenant and righteousness, namely the second stage, the real stage, the spiritual return from exile. Okay? Now, Jesus Christ, God's plan, as set forth in this prophecy, was far more, as I say, than simply getting Israel back into the land from Babylon. That was merely the outward and physical sign of God's overall plan. His overall plan involved ushering in the goal of the final Jubilee and inaugurating the everlasting new covenant. That plan could only be brought about by the anointed prince, namely the Messiah, known as the servant of the Lord. And that is none other than Jesus Christ. Now, so what, if you take a look at this, it's very interesting how things, I think, work out messianically. Cyrus gave a decree in about 539 to 537 BC, in allowing the return from exile and the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. But in Ezra 6 speaks of Cyrus's decree Darius's, and then Artaxerxes' decree as though they were all part of a single decree. Darius's decree in Ezra 6 was based upon the fact that Cyrus had already issued the decree to permit the return and rebuilding of Jerusalem. And Ezra 6 shows that Artaxerxes' decree, which is found in Ezra 7, was also an extension of Cyrus's original decree. So the decree which Cyrus drafted in 537 to restore the temple is not completed until 457 BC under Artaxerxes, which is therefore the date of the word to rebuild Jerusalem. And if you take that date, Artaxerxes, which basically completes the prior decrees of Cyrus and Darius, if we assume Artaxerxes' decree from 457 BC, the precise middle of the 70th week would be around AD 31. Now, that date is of questionable historical significance, but both AD 30 and AD 33, which are the two dates proposed for the crucifixion, fall within the 70th sabbatical cycle and that 70th week. Now, even though there are assumptions here and unknowns, by using the 457 BC decree date, this prophecy remains an astounding prediction, finding fulfillment in Jesus of Nazareth, and yet allows for differences in calculating the date of the crucifixion, which, is always dated between AD 27 and AD 34. In other words, the 70th week from 457 BC. So this corroborates that the 70 weeks is based on the sabbatical cycle, and that the 70 weeks are being used symbolically, and they can be legitimately used chronologically, and they all culminate in Christ. And if you look at it, Christ is the fulfillment of those promises in verse 24. To finish the transgression. The word transgression indicates apostasy and rebellion. Well, the work of shutting up sin can only be the work of God, which was done by Christ, who is our great deliverer. He shut up transgression by his atoning death on the cross. It says to make an end of sin in verse 24. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It says to make an atonement for iniquity. The thought here seems to be either the sacrifice will be offered and therefore sin expiated, or the necessary sacrifice will be offered and therefore sin is pardoned and forgiven. And so basically, Jesus deals with all aspects of our sin. It says to bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, of course, because atonement takes care of our sin, everlasting righteousness is brought about. And so the final complete atonement for sin establishes righteousness. This was effected by Christ during the 70th week. But think about this. In Romans 3, verses 21 and 22, it says, "But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God." In other words, Christ is the righteous one, and his righteousness is imputed to us. He not only takes our sin, but it gives us his righteousness. So he not only atones for sin, finishes the transgression, makes an end of sin, but brings in everlasting righteousness. It says to seal up the vision and prophecy in verse 24. Well, that is revealed. When Christ came, there was no further need for prophetic revelation in the Old Testament sense. And that's confirmed in Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 2, which says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and to the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. And then it says, to anoint the most holy. Now, the most holy phraseology speaks of the Messiah, who is that holy one who is to be born, according to Luke 1, verse 35, and a number of other passages which I cite in the book. It is of Christ that the ultimate redemptive jubilee is prophesied by Isaiah in Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2, which says that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has appointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to open the prison those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. In other words, now, oftentimes anointing was used of people, but also used to consecrate persons for office. It can refer to consecrating the Mosaic tabernacle and its holy objects. Well, one writer concludes, and I will conclude the lecture with this. Only in Daniel 9, verse 24, do we have basically the Holy of Holies being anointed. This phrase would be construed as the most holy place or the most holy person. The latter meaning would be most unusual. Thus, we have a verb that is normally used of a person and an object normally used of the temple. This may suggest that both the future king and temple are one and the same, and it finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ, who is both the Messiah and the true temple. Remember, the New Testament portrays Christ as the true and greater king, the true and greater high priest, and the true and greater temple, which is why I think ultimately Daniel 9, 24 through 27 is pointing to Christ and finds its fulfillment in what Christ did when he came the first time, both in his life and in his death on the cross. He is the fulfillment.